now have Pauline Yao, who is the lead curator for M Plus, which is in Hong Kong. And Pauline joined M Plus, which is yet to be built, and we're all looking forward to it. Which is M Plus, which is a museum of visual culture. She joined in 2012. And prior to joining the museum, Pauline served as assistant curator of Chinese art at the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco. And she holds an MA in East Asian Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago. In 2006, Pauline traveled to China on a Fulbright grant and subsequently co-founded Arrow Factory in Beijing, one of the more important alternative art spaces which housed Chinese art, contemporary art during that period. In 2007, she was the inaugural recipient of the Chinese Contemporary Art Awards Critic Award. And she's the author of several books, one of which is A Production Mode, Contemporary Art in China, and was the co-editor of 3 years in Arrow Factory. She now continues to be the lead curator for M+, and she's curating at the moment 2 shows for the current space they have, which is temporary space owned by West Kowloon. So I'll leave it to Pauline. Just to tell everyone that after Pauline's lecture, we have 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. So and we have mics on either side of the aisle.
Thanks. What time should I finish? 40 minutes. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. So thank you very much, Joselina, for that introduction, and thanks as well to the MCAD team for bringing me here. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to speak to you about my work as a curator and what I do at M+, what brought me to M+, and and what brought me to where I am right now. It's also a kind of interesting exercise in a sense, because I think people often are very curious how curators end up where they are and end up doing what they do. So it gives me a chance to kind of reflect on that and think about it and think about what is the role of a curator. I chose this sort of title of curating in an institutional context because I wanted to, I guess I wanted to talk about in some way what I do at M+, which is, of course, a museum with a collection, and I'll explain more about that. But because I think curating in an institutional context is something that I have done a lot of in my career, but I also have had time and moments where I was working independently, and they're two very different ends of a spectrum, and often people might not understand how these two things can kind of go together. But for me, they're obviously, because I'm the one doing both of them, there's a sort of reason or logic behind that. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today. So I guess I have some sort of preamble kind of things, which I wanted to mention. Let me just put this first slide here. So I'm just going to start off with this 2 images. Well, one is, this is basically a way of starting off my talk by referencing a work that was done by Japanese artist Saburo Murakami, so not to be confused with Takeshi Murakami, right? Takashi Murakami, Louis Vuitton bags. No, this is something different. Now we're talking about Saburo Murakami, who is an artist who was active in the Gutai art group in Japan in the 1950s, so in the post-war period. So I'm just going to read because I have some notes here. So in the summer of 1956, in a park in Ashiya City in central Japan, artist Saburo Murakami dangled an empty wooden picture frame from a tree branch and named it All Landscapes. It was his contribution to the first outdoor Gutai art exhibition, which was a gathering that took place in this outdoor park in Ashiya City and would become a landmark event in the history of avant-garde art. All Landscapes allowed audiences to capture chance views of the actual physical landscape. Swinging in the open air, the frame was rarely still, meaning that whatever was enclosed within it was constantly shifting and entirely dependent on where the viewer stood and in relation to it. Murakami's gesture was intended as a commentary on the underlying structures of painting, specifically the act of picturing, something of a preoccupation amongst Murakami's Gutai compatriots. The empty frame was a mechanism by which one could demonstrate the seamless relationship between art and life. But as indicated by the title, All Landscapes, the work also pointed to a sense of limitlessness, since there are no bounds which can be framed. No bounds as to what can be framed, and by the same token, no limit to the perspectives or positions from which one can look through the frame. In so doing, All Landscapes attempted to realign the categories of subject and object, viewer and viewed, but enabled a broader understanding of what it means to be seen, to see and to be seen. So the frame in Murakami's work, and this is just a, so this is the other work that maybe people would recognize by this artist. So an artist who is continually engaging with this notion of the frame, and particularly in relationship to sort of picturing and painting, and wanting to literally break through it and disrupt it and sort of break open this frame so that anything sort of in life, and there would be sort of a, anything could become art and vice versa. So, my reasoning for bringing this in is because I feel a lot of what I do as a curator is essentially about framing, is about providing a context, and that frame can shift and move and you can put it around, you can put it around an artwork, you can put it around a geography or a place, or you could put it around a certain set of practices. But in any case, it's a kind of shifting, frame and a framework that one builds through the process of either it's building a collection or building an exhibition, which is to say that it's like entirely dependent on the context and place in which I'm working, or which in this case, which I'm working, which could be an institution, or it could also be a different geographical location. So I'm just gonna, this is just a funny comment on the sort of notion. I find this funny. I mean, of course, it's sort of poking fun at this kind of elitist idea of curating, and that one can be curating children's parties. But I think for me, what I do find perhaps revealing about something like this is what it sort of speaks to in terms of specialization, right? Like this notion of, I come from kind of maybe a more, conservative or traditional context where I studied art history. That's my, and I studied, Asian art, focused on contemporary Chinese art. That's sort of what has been my specialization. That's what roots me and grounds me in a lot of the work that I do. And I tend to bring that towards what I think of as curating, is coming with that kind of specialization. And so I kind of am constantly toggling back and forth between feeling that, on the one hand, I have that kind of, certain kind of knowledge and expertise, which then makes me qualified, I guess, to, to select, to work with artists to bring, certain, either it's research on a collection or making an exhibition or doing another kind of project. But then on the other hand, I think there's another part of curating which is really just about facilitating, and it's really just about helping artists to sort of realize their vision and what they want to do. In that sense, the specialization part kind of sometimes falls into the background a little bit. And I have worked on exhibitions of tons of different kinds of content that is not all related exactly to my specialization. And so one can, I think that's something I learned very early on, is that I would, especially working in a museum, be thrown into contexts where I would have to learn. I just have to learn all that information, content, subject matter, in order to be able to then sort of form a kind of expertise or knowledge base around that. And one of the first, when I was at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, I had joined that museum. I had been studying, art history, Chinese art and Asian art, more traditional and classical, and then was brought into that museum with the idea to do sort of more modern projects. But one of the first projects that I was assigned was to do a Chinese carpets exhibition from the collection. I was like, I don't know anything about carpets. You don't learn about carpets generally when you're doing art history in the States. In Asian art history, you learn about paintings, and sometimes you learn a little bit about ceramics, but it tends to be very heavy on paintings and image-based things. And so certain kinds of crafts are not often part of that curriculum, are not a very strong one, because you really need to be seeing, the objects. And then so Chinese carpet. So I quickly read everything I could read on it, and spent a lot of time in storage, looking at the works and getting to know them, and researching about them individually, and made this exhibition, which was not a major, gigantic exhibition in the context of that museum, but it still was a kind of from the collection type of show, and a lot of those carpets had not been shown in a very long time. So it was a lesson, I guess, for me in terms of that idea about specialization. It's like it sometimes is all important, and then other times I think as a curator you have to be able to learn sort of like on the spot and on the go. So I'm gonna just mention and talk about Aerofactory for a few minutes. So just sort of going back in time a little bit to 2006. So as I mentioned earlier, I was working at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, and I had been doing a lot of research on contemporary Chinese art and spending time visiting China to see exhibitions and meet artists. And then I eventually applied for a Fulbright grant, and so I received a Fulbright in 2006, and that allowed me to go to China for 1 year. And the research that I was doing on that was related to Chinese collectors. So I was really fascinated by, again, like the sort of moment in time that was happening then, which was that the Chinese art market was growing rapidly, and there was a kind of new generation of Chinese collectors who were getting involved in that, whereas previously it had been mostly, foreign collectors who were building their collections of contemporary Chinese art. So I went to China on this research grant for 1 year to meet and talk to Chinese collectors about their ideas about collecting. It so happened that I ended up staying for 6 years, slightly kind of accidentally. I didn't intend to stay that long. But one of the things I was doing was in 2007, late 2007, early 2008, I began running this art space called Aerofactory. And Aerofactory is a kind of unusual space, because it's sort of like, we were sort of like this anti-art space thing. We were really just a storefront kind of window. We didn't have any money, so we just designed it the way we could do without any real budget and with no funding, and then we tried to keep it going, and it sort of miraculously still survives to today. So 10 years, can't believe that. But I guess I'm mentioning it because, it was a major project for me as a curator, but also because it came out entirely because of the context that I was working and the place that I was. And that context was, as I mentioned, this rapidly growing art scene in China. And 798, the sort of gallery district, was new galleries opening like every few months, gigantic spaces, kind of industrial, some of them purpose built, some of them more industrial spaces, 300, 400 square meters. I mean, these are really gigantic, there were mostly commercial spaces and very few museums that were active at that time. So it was, the art market was really picking up its pace, and the sort of dominant trend was to work in a very spectacular and large scale kind of way. So with Aero Factory, myself and two other artists, friends, we just decided we wanted to do something that was going in a different direction, that was going to be focused on something small, focused on a neighborhood and a place and a context, kind of like embedding the space in a particular, it was a residential area, so it was nowhere near the art galleries. But I think the location was only really one aspect. I think the other aspect of it really had to do with the fact that, so this is the store window, and it's just in this very small alley. Wait, I'll show you one image. This is about as wide as the street is. You can tell, you can fit like one. It's not a very great photo, but I'm just so you can see the scale of how big the street was. It's the size of for one car to fit, and maybe a bicycle on the side. So if two cars are coming from other directions, one of them has to back up or go forward, and they have to kind of squeeze around each other. And again, it was totally practically devised. Like we found a very small space. It was very cheap. It was just downstairs from my friend's flat, and we just thought, okay, we'll try this for a while, and then maybe we'll find a better place. But then it ended up being a really nice location to be in, because it was kind of off the big street, and it was a little bit more quiet there, and it was kind of embedded within a residential neighborhood. So we began to really find that to be a very interesting way to work. So just to explain a little bit about what you're seeing, artists were just using this space however they wanted. So we invited artists to do projects there. They came up with proposals. Often they paid out of their pocket to do a lot of it. We would chip in a little bit of money, and we really just, again, it's really going back to sort of like a sort of site-specific or context kind of specific way of working. And each time the space would transform itself. We didn't, because we had no money, we didn't have any person there. So there was never a gallery sitter, like a person to greet you if you came to see. You actually couldn't go inside. You just walk by on the street. And so when you're walking by in the street, you would see a window. You probably wouldn't really even know what it is that you're seeing there. There's not really, and this going back to Murakami, there isn't a frame around it to tell you this is an art space. We barely had any signage, because we're also really aware of wanting to be under the radar in terms of the Chinese, the government and the sort of local, sort of restrictions on running a space. We didn't have any permits or anything like that. So we kind of wanted to be, sort of under the radar. Occasionally we put a small piece of text sort of stuck to the wall. Often it would just fall down, but I mean, there was a little bit of explanation, I guess, for the person who did want to stop and look a little bit more. And artists were using it in different ways. So this is kind of a store window way display. The artist had worked with a tailor who was in the street to make these dresses.
one artist totally transformed our space to look just like the neighbors. This is a shop that sells, like pancake bread. So he just totally took down our windows and made a copy, and then he had shot video of them, and then he projected the video. So at night, so during the day, it was just like a storefront that looked just like a mirror of what was next door. So it was kind of like this uncanny experience when you walk by during the day. You'd see like, wait, this is kind of a repetition. It's the same, looks exactly the same, but there was during the day it would just be a white paper on the windows. You wouldn't see any projection until it was nighttime. And the idea that he was trying to sort of, in a way, comment on this idea of labor and the people who had been working in that pancake shop, they work really long hours. So basically when they leave, then their projection would be visible on our storefront, and then when they come to work in the morning, the projection goes off. So it's kind of like they're almost like working constantly. And then we had artists who, did projection from inside with sound. So this is like the chandelier piece that moves back and forth, and the scale, like sort of swings almost into your face. So playing again with the kind of scale. And then this artist had done a piece that was a moving wall, which is the only thing you can really tell. It's moving so slowly, like you almost can't tell that it's moving at all. And the only thing you can notice is if you stand there for a long time, you see that light on the wall becomes bigger or smaller, that circle, depending on the distance that the light is from the wall. So as you can tell, like a lot of these artists are really, in a way, playing with or acknowledging how people view that work. So like how they're, how, again, like back to this idea of how people would, how they would see it, how they would, perceive it or come across it, and that viewing experience. And a lot of times people walk past the space and, they kind of just do like they just sort of look for a second. And so, this one, the one you're seeing with the light is, again, it's like a reversal. It's like it asks you to stay there for a while and look at it for a longer period of time to even see whether or not the wall is moving, because it's like really, really, really slow. And in fact, it broke once and it wasn't moving at all. And then like people were convinced it was moving. So it's just kind of a back and forth. Like artists were doing things that connected with the neighborhood, like this light switch that you would turn on here, and then it would turn on. He linked it up to another shop that was like 200 meters away. The light would go off over there. There's a switch over there, like kind of creating these links and connections back and forth. Or just, removing the doors entirely from the space. And, the whole time that we're doing these projects, again, like very bare bones kind of operation, but it was for us a way to, and I mean for me as a curator, a very interesting way to work with artists at this moment in time in China when there was a lot of attention being placed on sort of the commercial spaces and the commercial art world. And I think that, there were people who kind of expected that this kind of space would be a place that we should shine a light on younger talents or new artists or younger artists, emerging artists, something like that. Like I think there's a kind of impression that we have that small nonprofit art spaces like this should be supporting, younger artists. But in fact, a lot of the artists you're seeing are very established artists. So artists who are mid-career and across multiple generations. I mean, we didn't really distinguish, but what I found interesting was that there was artists like, Zhang Peili, Wang Gongxin, like some of the most famous names in contemporary Chinese art, who at that time were interested to work with us, partly because we were offering a space and a context that was outside of a kind of commercial gallery sort of setting. And that a lot of the
gallery settings were offering kind of like, white box spaces, which were, quite common, and for some people, and that's fine, for a lot of artists, they wanted to have that kind of space. But I think there was a certain sort of generation of artists as well in China who had gotten their start by working in a way that was outside of a, proper dedicated museum or gallery space. And so having an opportunity to do something that was kind of more, like more engaged with a sort of specific location, and that itself, the space wasn't framed as an art space. That was an interesting opportunity for them. So that was for us a kind of realization of some kind that like every time, as a curator doing exhibitions, you can never really totally take into account all the different factors or reasons that might, be around or motivate an artist for having taking interest to do something like this, because we had really very little we were offering them. We were offering them like a 15 square meter space in the middle of a small alleyway in the middle of Beijing. I mean, like, no collectors were going to see this, like no journalists, like there was no attention. They weren't going to get anything out of it, so to speak, which is, a lot of artists do have to think about what would be the benefits for them. But so maybe for some of the older generation artists, it was also they were in the position to be able to do that, whereas some of the younger artists were thinking more about their careers. It was also kind of interesting and revealing about China at that time. So this is like the interior, so you can see just how, how small it is inside. Yeah. And this is what it looks like now. So it's gotten even smaller. It's a long story that one can Google Aero Factory and Artsy if you want to read the story. I didn't write it. My friend wrote an article to explain what has happened in the last year or so in China, in Beijing, with a lot of the storefronts. So, which basically is that a lot of the storefronts like ours, which were originally not entirely legal, have been kind of closed up again, have been bricked up. So our space, which has actually these three, big 3 doors that you've been seeing, there's actually a small door in the back that opens into a courtyard. And so it is technically part of a kind of courtyard architectural setting. And those doors that opened onto the road are now like viewed as not really being legal. So the government was going through and basically closing up a lot of these storefront shops and just bricking them up, and then people can still access by going through the courtyard, but of course it's not very practical for actual businesses. For us, we were very lucky that there was an artist who had made a project where he had already taken off the doors and already made a window, so the window just sort of stays now. And so Aero Factory does still technically exist. However, it is much smaller window, and not as big, and you have to kind of peer inside, and it's even less noticeable than it was. I mean, even before we barely had any signage. Now there's really no sign at all, so you probably wouldn't know it's there. But now I get to jump to M+. Yes, I purposely do this. Purposely try to comment on this opposite, what would seem as opposites, partly because I think it is something that often people ask me, like, how can you go from working in this tiny art space, which has no budget, and was very ad hoc, and to join a place like M+, which is a very large institution, still being built now, but obviously with government funding, with money to build a collection, and all that, and when we open, we'll be one of the largest institutions, public institutions for art in Asia. And I guess I'll get more into why that is, but I actually don't. I mean, I do feel there's a difference, of course. It'd be
kind of crazy to say there isn't any difference, but there are still a lot of connections and relations between these two ways of working. In Aero Factory, I guess, it was a space that we were able to work with artists in a variety of different ways with a lot of freedom. And it was unusual because it was, set within this little neighborhood. And as I mentioned, we didn't really make an effort in a way to reach out to people there. Like we didn't see ourselves at Aero Factory as playing much of a sort of educative role, I could say, which is very different than how I see my role at M+. But that partly had to do with the sort of factors and conditions that we were working in Beijing, where we couldn't really operate as like a fully, permitted and whatever licensed kind of art space. So we had to be a little bit under the radar. But it was also because I think we were interested at that time, and I was interested as a curator, and you can tell from a lot of the projects that we did, was interested in a way as just like having the work, having artists or having the work just be there and be part of people's lives, part of the neighborhood, in a way not necessarily trying to find a way to explain what it is to somebody and say, I'm going to tell you what this means. It would just be a kind of like something that was just inserted into their daily pattern or life, and then they just walk past. And how they, came to understand what it was or what they saw or what they experienced, I probably won't ever really totally know. And that wasn't really part of our expressed goal. It sounds really strange. I know it doesn't really fit with what a lot of people would imagine a museum curator to say, right? Like, I didn't really care about the audience. It's not that we didn't care about the audience. I think we weren't really invested in, or didn't see ourselves as wanting to be invested in that layer of interpretation, right? Which I think we knew was going to require a lot more than we could really do. And it was we just had to kind of make a decision at some point that that's as far as we could go, was that we wanted to have, but we still did want to have those works and those artists to have a chance and opportunity to engage with the context. But my work at M+ is, of course, very, very different in that way. So M+ is, these are just like images of the building that will be completed and open in 2020. It's part of the West Kowloon Cultural District. For people who know Hong Kong, or if you don't know Hong Kong, it's a gigantic land reclamation project, and it consists of this piece of land extending from here all the way down this sort of peninsula. It's one of the biggest cultural infrastructure projects like in the world or something. I don't know. There's all these very grand statements about it, but it is like totally, completely unprecedented to have such a large piece of land in Hong Kong, and where land is definitely comes at a premium, and then that it's being used as a to be turned into a sort of space for cultural facilities. So that includes M+. We're the only, collecting museum there, but a lot of other performing arts facilities as well. And so over here is a Shichu Center, which is actually opening next year. And then there'll be a number of different cultural facilities along here. There'll be hotels, there'll be office buildings, there'll be some residential. So it's a mixed use in that whole district, basically. So, this is the harbor, central Wanjai, and that's the location of West Kowloon. So it sits with this like really totally amazing view looking back at Hong Kong Island, and then connected to Kowloon. And then this is the whole district where you can see the size. It's quite an old photo, so like ignore that, because that's not there. That actually is the location of the future Palace Museum.
So there will be a kind of branch of the Palace Museum in Beijing, in West Kowloon, being built there. So it's a space where they'll be bringing parts of the collection from the Palace Museum in Beijing to Hong Kong in a purpose-built architecture that's actually breaking ground very soon. So that project was that decision to have that museum is relatively new. And then previously it was thought there was discussion about having like a gigantic performance venue, like a stadium kind of like place for performances. But I actually think it's much better to have a museum. And the Palace Museum is, of course, more traditional classical art, but also very important. And I think for us at M+, we're really happy that that'll be there, because what we're doing at M+ is very much starting from like 1950 onwards. So there isn't really much to give a kind of larger historical lens. So I think it'll be interesting to have these two institutions within close proximity of one another, when there previously has been very little in Hong Kong overall. So M+ will be here, and then this is also a park area. And then there'll be other lyric opera, Center for Performing Arts, and whatnot along this main boulevard. So that's what it looks like now. So M+ is coming up very quickly, and we have like the gallery almost entirely on this level, and some on the lower level, and then this tower which goes up, which you saw in that first rendering of the building. The tower will have like our research center, offices, and there'll be some restaurants and things like that, but mainly the galleries are on this kind of horizontal level. And it's, in terms of size and scale, it's really gigantic. It's more or less the same size that you would find with, if you've ever been to the Tate and Tate Modern and the Tate Switch House, the new buildings, the two of them together, it's approximately that size. So it's like, in terms of exhibition space, I think it's like 14,000 square meters or something. Yeah, it's really huge. And the building itself is like 60,000. So the numbers that, like, I don't even know if that really means anything to anybody, because it's really hard to comprehend. Just imagine, like, the same as around the same size that you would find the gallery spaces at MoMA New York, except for us, they're all going to be on one level. Yeah. We have this M+ Pavilion, which is a purpose-built, freestanding building that is around 300 square meters, and that's a space that we've been using in the last like 2 years or so, or for exhibitions. So previously we were doing exhibitions in this kind of pop-up fashion, where we'd rent a space somewhere in Hong Kong and show either parts of our collection or commission artists to do projects. But now we have this pavilion building, which is located right next to our construction site. So that photo you saw of the construction site was taken from the pavilion. So they're very close. And the pavilion is just, it was built by a Hong Kong architect. It has, again, like just one gallery space. I think I should have one image of it. Yeah, it's not a huge space, but workable space. The idea, in our using this for programs is really as a way to, kind of like start to bring people to West Kowloon and to where M+ is, but also just to have a fixed location. It's right now it's located within a construction site. It's not that ideal, but at least it's a place where we can be showing parts of our collection through various different kind of exhibition programs. So one of the shows that I'm working on is this one, which is opening next month. And I'm co-curating this with a colleague of mine, Shirley Surya, who works in our architecture and design. And sorry, it's a little bit just
just throwing a bunch of names at you, but and I put the visual art ones in blue. The rest are architecture, design, designers, graphic designers, or various like firms, companies or firms. And I mean, this kind of in a way goes back to that comment I was making about the sort of specialization. I mean, my area of specialization comes primarily from Chinese art, but I've been living in Asia for now 10 years, traveling quite extensively in the region and working on a number of shows around the region. And although I'm not, don't consider myself necessarily a Southeast Asian contemporary art specialist, I do know our collection, and I have been deeply involved in building the collection. And I think that is, part of working in an institutional context is that notion of specialization gets a little bit, gets sort of more complex in a way. Most of us as curators come into that institution with our own areas of expertise, which we continue to build. But when you're in the institution as well and you're involved in building the collection and you have to do so much research involved in the different works and artists that we collect, then over time you kind of realize like your specialization is what the M+ collection is. Because that's what you're spending all your time around. And not to say that I, have lost the what I had previously, but it just sort of shifts, and that lens and again that frame kind of shifts again, where I end up seeing and looking at everything sort of through this kind of lens of the institution and how it relates in a way to what we've collected already, or what we're sort of the sort of narratives that we're looking to build through the collection. So this exhibition comes out of, is a series. We've been doing a series of shows from our collection, and this is the first one we're doing that is based around a region, a geography, like basically about like a place, which is to say that the previous exhibitions have either been focused on, maybe Chinese art at a certain moment in time, or have been looking at the design collection, like the whole of our design collection exhibited, or ink art was a previous exhibition we had, or maybe we had a show which was Samson Young, which was the show from Venice that we do during the Venice Biennial, and that comes back to Hong Kong. And so this was really like, I think for us, the first time we wanted to show a part of our collection that we have that we've been building since like 2014 or so, but just hadn't really had many opportunities to look at this and through this kind of lens of this one, geographic locale or designation. And we decided as well to do it as a multidisciplinary show, as a cross-disciplinary show. So it's visual art as well as architecture and design together. Also kind of a first for us, but something that relates very much to visual culture as a whole. Like M+ is a museum of visual culture, and people often ask what that is, what that means. I think it can mean a variety of different things, and I could read you all my notes about that, but maybe I won't. But I think ultimately what visual culture sort of points to is that idea of a shifting and moving frame, and that there are multiple perspectives and multiple views that one can take on any given subject or any given place or set of practices. So we felt that doing a show that was going to be ostensibly looking at the region of Southeast Asia through things in our, how Southeast Asia sort of is figured within our collection. So that means it's not limited only to people and makers and artists and architects who live there. There are people, there are artists from outside the region who may have made work that relates to it. We felt like to sort of highlight this idea of visual culture, to do something that was looking across the two different disciplines, might be a way to sort of reflect this multi-dimensionality of this place anyway. And that there have been
shows, visual art exhibitions that have been done on this subject of Southeast Asia in recent years, and this is a very small show. It's also really based on our collection, so we're not comprehensive, and we can't be, but yeah, so again, like, we're kind of almost counteracting this idea by putting like more stuff. It's going to be quite dense. There's a lot of historical materials in there, like architecture and design archives. So there'll be drawings, models, photographs, extending from I think the earliest work we have in the show is from 1930s, some colonial posters, but then mostly from 1950s up to present. And the works that we have in the collection for visual art that relate to Southeast Asia are almost entirely contemporary artworks. And then the things that we have in the collection that relate to Southeast Asia that are from the architecture and design part of our collection are almost all historical things that don't really go into the contemporary moment. So, it's a kind of interesting mixing and matching of these two things. It is definitely an experiment, like everything, to try and find a way to kind of present this in a way that is, it's the first time it's presented in a way like, I think there's an impulse to think that what we're doing is going to be very comprehensive. It won't be, but still there'll be a lot of things there to see and a lot of information to digest, and that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. So I'm going to use the remaining time to talk about the M+ collection. And the collection is, I could talk about this for hours. So what I have is just like a kind of just visual art. I'm not even going to go talk about design and architecture and moving image, because that could take even longer. But just like statistically, or just give you the facts, basically. The collection covers visual art, it covers architecture and design, and moving image. Then we'd say moving image, that crosses over a lot with art, of course, video art, film, whatnot, but it also includes, internet art, digitally born artworks, animation, things like that are kind of more within the just dealing with that medium of moving image, and also Hong Kong cinema related kinds of materials. And then 1950 or so to the present, so we are collecting second half of 20th century, sort of post-war period till now. People often ask why. Why do we choose that time period? It's less really our choice than I think a decision that was made and in the early days as the museum was being formulated, that had a lot to do with sort of practical realities. Like, we have a short amount of time to build this collection, and we have limited resources. Although we do have a budget. Like, we do have a budget from the Hong Kong government to build this collection. It's definitely not, infinite. And if one wants to build a collection of the entire 20th century, you would need, far more funds and resources than we have. So, it seemed also that really this is a museum that needs to be looking into the future as well, not only going further into the past, and to sort of, basically start with a kind of the massive, paradigm shift, change, and especially in this part of the world, it would have to be the, 1949 or the end of the Second World War and the sort of reverberations of that in this region. So that sort of ends up being the starting point. And then beyond that, it's really kind of like everything. Like, there's no media, like, as I said, it's visual culture, which is kind of a scary prospect, because that can kind of encompass almost everything in the world. And then, of course, when you look at design, that can encompass like mass-produced objects and industrial design, as well as, furniture and also graphic design. It's really a gigantic sort of remit. But having said that, I think the way that we think about things in terms of visual art and the work that I do as a curator, and plus and being involved with the collection is I work alongside team of curators who all of us have different areas of specialization and focus. Some of them are more media specific, and some more geographic. But we're coming together now and having these really interesting conversations about how we're going to display the collection when we open. So we have around like maybe 5,000, 6,000 works in the collection. We also have like over 10,000 archives. So actually it's sort of like, we try now to refer to it now as like the M+ collections, like plural, because we've also collected other collections. Like we've collected Uli Sig, the Sig collection of contemporary Chinese art, which was like 1,500 works that was donated, partial purchase, partial donation. So that sort of sits, within M+, you have the M+ Sig collection. There's a few other gifts that have come to us in groups. So I guess to sort of respect that is kind of, we're now referring as like the M+ collections. And then of course the archival materials almost predominant, almost entirely architecture and design related, but may in the future encompass some artists' archives. Sits as like another a different kind of cataloging, different kind of display, and all of that, but all loosely part of the collection. So now we're in the process of planning our displays when we open in 2020, late 2020. So we're basically planning to open the museum with our collection on view. So a lot of the work that I'm doing now as curator is really like diving into what we have. And we are continuing to add to it, but it's it's really about creating these kind of interpretive frameworks and really trying to, again, like use that idea of Murakami's frame, like thinking where we are situated and how one sort of looks at this recent kind of art history from this part of the world, like from where we sit in Hong Kong. Like how do you start to talk about or even try to present the developments of, or various kinds of developments of visual art over the last 60 years, without relying on what we're used to relying on when you talk about art history, this relying on Western art. How do you try to do that sort of from this place? M+ is also very unique, I would say, in that we have a very sort of transnational perspective on what we do, which is to say, like we're, I think, quite unique that there are other new institutions coming online in Asia that are looking at contemporary art and or modern art in the region, and but a lot of those and a lot of the existing museums are very nationally focused. And plus is an entirely like a non-national project, right? It is the Hong Kong government funding, but we are a global institution, so we don't have any sort of need or ambition to fulfill a kind of message that one might have if we were really had this national in our title, which is why I think M+ was chosen as a name to kind of skirt around any of that sort of baggage. So when I talk about this kind of like trying to build these narratives and think about how art history or art has sort of developments over the last 50 years, we look at this from an entirely sort of transnational perspective. So you look at kind of, this is again, I'm just going to flip through these, but examples of artists active in the region and outside the region. So again, like it's always a conversation between what's happening maybe with artists who are based here, as well as those who may have left, and those dialogues that happen. But also how abstraction as a kind of mode of working became quite popular across different regions at different times for different reasons, and that developed out of different kinds of histories. So you may have calligraphy as
some background context, you may have landscape, realism. So, you know, Gutai artists, I mentioned Murakami earlier, and the Gutai artists are some of the, like, I think even in, you know, histories of Western, you know, avant-garde art now trace back quite a lot to Gutai. So it's obviously one of the most important art movements that was happening in Asia, even though there may not have been a huge amount of conversation between those artists and other parts of Asia at the time that they were working. It is interesting now to look back and see some of the connections you can find. So even something like Cai Guoqiang, an artist, Chinese artist who was in Japan at the same time that, not same later than the Gutai artist, but had been kind of, you know, involved with the same idea of experimenting with different kinds of materialities and different ways of making art with unconventional materials or different kinds of, you know, action-based. So, you know, Shiraga, the Gutai artist, who's very well known for making paintings with his feet, like this, and then Cai Guoqiang was using gunpowder on the canvas. And then and a period which, you know, painting and beginning of sort of some conceptual practices, 1970s across in this case mostly Korea, showing. Sorry. And again, there's always sort of a dialogue that's happening with artists who are outside the region. So someone like Kusama, very important artist working, you know, who was in New York, but really influencing. She was traveling, coming back, and these were, you know, works that this one in this corner and the next one, this one, a really rare, unusual installation piece that she did over several years. So she started this when she was in New York, and then when she went back and brought this back with her when she went back to Japan and continued it and finished it. So Namjoon Pack, there's a couple artists, like a couple of these slides will just show you there's certain sort of anchor artists, you would say, for us, people who I think irregardless of where they were, you know, working, or the fact that they were Asian, or the fact that he was, you know, Korean-born, were just pioneers, you know. They were people who were putting forward ideas and practices that were truly unique and exceptional in their time, and pushing forward different kinds of artistic languages that hadn't been seen before. And, you know, these are the kind of artists that we're trying in our collection to, you know, identify, or we've found over time that there's people that just become kind of natural anchor points. And so we have put together this collection of works by Namjoon Pack that spans his career, but then we also think about, like, how, you know, one could imagine showing these, like, with one of the, you know, a major work in the middle, and then you can make these links to all the other works by the artist. But then I think there's other ways that we think about it, which might have to do with, like, how you can link someone like Namjoon Pack to whole generations of artists that are working in moving image. And, you know, that would extend from someone who was closer in his generation, like John Cage, but also Patty Chang, just animation, it's like he sort of becomes a kind of seed, you know, one could say. And so when we're talking about how we're planning to show the collection, sometimes we think about these kinds of artists and how one can make these connections. So this is an example of a work that we have by Andreas Gursky. There's this photograph of the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank building, and then how that would link out maybe more along the lines of looking at urbanization in Hong Kong and architecture and design. So encompasses some things from our architecture and design collection. But as well, like someone like Mark Bradford, who, you know, came to Hong Kong and then made these paintings about the housing housing complexes there as well. And then just continuing this logic again, Cai Guoqiang as, this work potentially linking out to other expat Chinese artists. So, in talking about this notion of the transnational, it's a really big part of our collection, and it's a really big, I think, part of understanding or how one begins to talk about, Asian contemporary art. What is Asia? Like, what does that mean? And who is included in the story and who isn't. We're quite open with that. But Cai Guoqiang is someone that definitely could be sort of a pivot point for looking at all the other artists from China who had left or had careers elsewhere. Or looking just across, like purely across his way of working, right? Using gunpowder, references to sort of alchemy, or how one is transforming the way of making paintings. So across a variety of different locations and generations. And then I think I should wrap up. I'll just show you these last couple of slides because it's a little bit more into like the current moment. Includes so Xie Deqing is another artist, so I didn't include this kind of like chart thing but again, someone you could link out to all kinds of performance art practices in the region and beyond. We've collected his entire oeuvre, which is 6 artworks, 6 one-year performances. So it's very unusual that as an institution, a lot of these haven't even been shown before. I think a few of them have been shown repeatedly, and then there's a couple that have not been shown almost at all since they've been made. But I guess just for a sort of side note, I'm being like, a curator versus art historian sort of moment is like, art historically, we all know how important Xie Deqing is, or one reads about his work, you can get very involved in the ideas, and he's super fascinating. But I guess as a curator institution, what it really boils down to as well is like, what do we have? Like, what do we collect? Like, what are the actual objects? And what are the things, right? It's performance, right? So then you get into all these questions of documentation. He has very particular views on how his work is shown. How one goes about displaying things. I mean, every time we're doing a show, of course, there's lengthy conversations we have to have with every artist about how we show their work. How we collect it, and we own it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have all these other answers to all the other intricacies of how that work is exhibited, which ultimately does affect how it's sort of like meaning is created for other viewers, right, and for the audiences. And I find that process like so fascinating. I think that's what I really enjoy as being a curator, is getting into sort of the sort of physicality of it. And that's where I do think, like, even going back to sort of something like Arrow Factory. Part of what Arrow Factory was about like bringing a work into sort of like someone's sort of life, like that sort of real-time experience. And there are people who question like why M+ even has a collection. Like, what's the point of collecting today? Because we can all look online. You can read about Xie Deqing's work. You can see photographs of his work. You can probably see tons of images of all these things in our collection. But like, and like people think, oh, we're spending so much public money to collect these things and to preserve them and take care of them for hundreds and hundreds of years. And kind of like, what's the point? Because it's all sort of shareable through virtual means. But I don't buy into that at all, because I do think I think the physical, like live in the flesh experience is what it's all about. And that is why I think partially working at M+ and working at Arrow Factory may seem, poles apart, but they're related to that same kind of thing. It's related to that experience and related to how
how a sort of visitor or audience or person experiences something in that kind of live context and space. So thank you very much. I'm happy to have questions from Rosalina. I'm sure she's going to ask me more. Thank you.
Thanks, Pauline. So if there are questions, I mean, I have my own, as she knows, but thanks so much for the incredibly thorough conversation about M+ and RO Factory. So if there are questions, we have 10 minutes, starting now. I think it's very important that actually Pauline talked about how curating actually happens within the mind of a curator. But I think maybe you could tell us more about how this core of collecting for M+ came about. I think you tried to talk about it, but I think what were the initial works that were included in the collection? Is it more, I don't want to go, as you say, it's a transnational collection, so I don't want to go if it's more Chinese or more Southeast Asian or Asian in a larger sense, because Etel Adnan was there. So it's a bit more complex than that. So perhaps you could tell us more, because I know it must have started with the SIG collection.
Yeah,
which is predominantly contemporary Chinese art.
Yeah. I mean, the collection has come together, like everything, it comes together in this, in a way that it's partly planned and targeted, and there's something like strategic about it, and then there's like serendipity. There's just like things that just happen that you would never know, and I think. And then of course, everything that enters the collection, like, affects like the next decision. It's like this like organism, and it's constantly mutating or something. And so, 2012 was when the collecting sort of began officially, and very early on, actually, I think like Xie de Qing was one of the early collected works. So Xie de Qing, up to that time, his work, the entirety of his work did not exist in any institution. He hadn't. I think maybe there's like Shaolin institutions have like one of the 1-year performances, but he was interested in having like one institution to have all of his work, and he wants to have one in Asia. So this is before I joined M+, but Xie de Qing was early in that discussion. And then, the SIG collection, which is like over 1,500 works of contemporary Chinese art from Swiss collector Uli Sig. And that was a like game changer, I guess, because Uli had that collection built over 20 years and was looking for a home for it. But, and I think he was interested in having it, enter into the sort of like, an institution in China, basically, because he had been collecting these works, and they've been largely in his storehouse in Geneva, in Switzerland. And so, that was his idea and ambition, but I think his real goal was that he wanted the collection to be seen. Like no collector wants to give away their collection to a museum that's not going to be able to guarantee that it can be shown, right? And I think he didn't have that insurance from many of the museums in China, which would have maybe taken it, but they would just be like putting it in storage, and maybe it would never see the light of day. And he that wasn't like something he wanted to do. So M+ began that conversation with him, and then and it was there's of course there's an agreement. We will show the work in opening, of course, but that would have been part of our plan anyway. But anyway, I think that was a game changer in the sense that, for those of us like me who were in the contemporary Chinese art field, you knew the SIG collection, and then you're like that was given to M+. Like, because at that time, M+ seemed like this little thing you'd heard about, but you didn't really know it was going to happen or not. Because West Kowloon had been in discussion for so many years, and no one really knew. Like,
is it going to happen? You know, like, what's the story? But then, like, when I heard that, I was like, oh, okay, this is like for real. Like, no institution can enter into such an arrangement with such a collector and not, you know, be able to like deliver. And so that was a very important thing. But of course, that like also skewed the whole collection towards visual art and Chinese contemporary art. So so then we kind of had to like do a lot of more work on. I mean, Hong Kong's a huge and very important core of it's where we are, right? So, but it's not. We don't limit our collection to Hong Kong, but it is like hugely important. So, so there were, you know, additions to the collection from Hong Kong artists, and then you know, around the world. And you know, Southeast Asia came into the picture very early on, I would say. Not again, like, it wasn't a strategy. It wasn't like, oh, now we're going to do Southeast Asia and then we're going to do this. Or we never think that way. It just kind of happened. It was like, oh, okay, now I guess we're doing this. Okay. Like, it's a bit of there's a mixture of planning and strategy, and then a mixture of sort of like I don't know, opportunities come up sometimes for things, and yeah. I don't know.
Other questions? Anything else? Any burning questions about M+? When it's opening, basically.
2020.
Okay. If there are
I love the metaphor of Murakami's frame, because as you're talking, there's just so many things, so many ways to look at what a museum or what a collection is, or even just what art is, or how it could be experienced. But then one aspect that really fascinates me, like when you were talking about the Aero Factory, there's this kind of, you referred to it as like almost like an anti-art space. And yeah, there's just a sense of wanting to show work which is really not commercial, which purposefully distances itself from that commercial world that art also circulates in, and is such a powerful engine for art, it seems, these days. And that in fact you're not just showing it at the Aero Factory young artists, but also older artists who also have the means to have this kind of attitude, like, oh, you know, I'm well off enough that I could do something which has not necessarily going to have so much commercial value. So I don't know, it's just a funny contradiction to me, you know, the kind of the economic aspect of art, but then this ideal that an artist could actually work in a way which is purposefully totally independent from it. And similarly with M+, I think, you know, you speak about the transnational scope or intention, and yet, I mean, I would imagine the reason why it's come to be has to do also with people representing political power or even national power, wanting to make a statement through culture. So once again, there's this kind of funny contradiction that kind of, it is both politically driven, culture is politically driven, and at the same time, there can be this ideal of an approach to culture which is purposefully distancing itself or creating a kind of independence from the political. So I wonder how you think about these things, because I imagine as a curator in this context, you're negotiating these different things. And in a way, it seems very invisible, these different layers of intention and engagement with society. Some are like really have to do with money, and some seem almost like spiritual. like how, and sometimes it's the money and the spiritual are like totally intertwined. So, right. So I wonder how you think about these things.
Yeah, it's very complex. It's true. I mean, I guess I'd say firstly about the Aero Factory and about the artists that were kind of, yeah, you could say sort of the, you know, older generation or something. Not like, you know, young emerging artists that we worked with. And you know, I think for them at that time, and just, you know, it's less about the political and more about this, like, commenting on the commercial kind of context. I think for them at that time, doing something at Aero Factory gave them a opportunity to, like, yeah, not have to think about, you know, like the commercial viability of something, right? Which maybe they had to be thinking about when they were doing exhibitions in other spaces. And so it wasn't that they were like artists who weren't active in the commercial world, right? They were, right? There was just like, okay, here's something else I can do, right? So that was one thing. But then I think another thing was that they were also, I mean, at least in my discussions, quite interested in reaching like people who were living in Beijing and that had nothing to do with the art world. You know, I think audience played a role, like, or yeah, so who was going to be seeing their work, right? And it was like as an interest or a desire. And again, it's not every artist who has that interest and desire, and it's not no one's better or worse because they have it, but it just happened to be that, you know, these artists that wanted to work with us, or we found interest and value in working with us, is, you know, not because it was going to be like, yeah, seen by collectors or be written up in a magazine. It was because like they thought that they would have a way to have their work reach a broader audience. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't about, you know, the sort of discourse as much as it was like it was kind of fundamental way that the art in China had been developing in a way away from that it was going more and more into this little like cocooned, you know, 798 art district gated center. This is where you go to look at art. Everywhere else is, you know, just is something else, right? But like having a way to break outside of that little bubble, the contemporary art bubble that was really big in Beijing at that time. So I'm not avoiding the political question, but I think that it was, for them, the sort of political thing was like, I'm kind of trying to, in a way, reach people in the place where they, you know, go buy their bread or go ride their bicycle, rather than expecting that those people are going to come to the art district, because they don't really. Basically, it's like trying to cross that divide. But then, yeah, talking about M+ and the question you brought up about, yeah, the sort of this idea of transnational and how that sort of sits within a broader, yeah, political context, or even the sort of the ambitions of a government wanting to appear that it's, you know, handling culture in a certain kind of way. I mean, in some senses, I think, yeah, maybe I'm brainwashed by like Lars and Nippa. It's just like Lars was our first director. But I think when the project began, I mean, this is of course before my time, but like when M+ began at the very beginning stages, it was like probably a little bit more of an inward looking thing, meaning like Hong Kong focused, and Hong Kong was like about giving a place for Hong Kong artists, Hong Kong designers, Hong Kong popular culture, like ink art. And I think Lars was instrumental in discussions with certain people to try to make that vision be bigger and broader. Not necessarily that it had to be using this word transnational, but that in order to really contribute or add something for the audiences in Hong Kong, because it's an institution that is aimed at the people who live in Hong Kong, right? That's our main audience. Then in order to really have that, like, have, you know, like meaning and weight and value and contribute something over like
the long lens of time, it has to go beyond Hong Kong. It can't just be like, whether or not it's national or not. I mean, you don't even have to use that word national, but it's just like, if it's just about the place, if it's just there to sort of celebrate Hong Kong only, it's not actually going to be doing as much as it would be to put Hong Kong in conversation with other places around, right? So maybe the transnational is a sort of term I'm using to describe the sort of landscape I see now, which has to do with other institutions and other collections that exist that we interface with, which are quite, nationally focused, and that we see ourselves in a different light, because we do kind of want to distinguish ourselves. But I do see it being less of like a sort of government ambition, even though the government is funding this project. It is still a, what do you call it, like a subsidiary kind of thing, like, or like the West Kowloon Cultural District Authority is the funder, and the authority is funded by the Hong Kong government. So it's like we're removed a little bit from that direct line, which gives us, I think, a little more sort of freedom. But Hong Kong is a very incredibly politically complex place right now. And so the sort of things that we deal with now in terms of the political context is less about the sort of transnational, more about like China, right? China versus Hong Kong. How you draw that line or don't draw that line. And when you talk about them that are contiguous the same, and when you talk about them one separate and different. That takes a lot of navigating and knowing the context. Yeah, and I mean, I guess before, in the very beginning, I do remember it was like very clear, like Hong Kong audience, and now it is shifting more. We're not only speaking to a Hong Kong audience, we're speaking to a mainland audience too. There's more and more porousness of that border. That means that the people who are living in Hong Kong are also people who come from the mainland, right? So, and it's just, our audience is, yes, people who live in Hong Kong, but that isn't necessarily limited to Hong Kong people, right? It's this kind of having to sort of, it's not really changing what we do, but it is like further sort of refining maybe the sort of language and terms we use when we talk about things.
Thank you so much, Pauline. I think we have to end now. It's gone much more than we expected. So thanks so much, Pauline, for coming to Manila. And thank you very much for coming to the talk. Just to move our lecture series forward, we'll be having Pablo Leon de la Barra and Susanna Pfeffer in our next two public lecture series. Just look out for the dates in our social media. Thank you very much.